everybody.
Hi, John. How are you?
Okay.
And John, you were from Cisco. Welcome back. Thanks for joining again. And we have Jason. Jason, I've added your name to the meeting notes. Do you mind commenting on which organization are you with?
Hi. Yeah, I'm on your mailing list, and I'm a solutions engineer with Mirantis, and we work a lot with Kubernetes and Istio, and this looks interesting to me.
Awesome. Cool. Let's see. And so we've got Aidan, Harvey's got. Okay, cool. We'll just give it another minute. And we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 questions here that from 3 carryover from last time, and then two new ones. So we'll get to those. And then we can just have whatever other open discussions. Actually, Harvey, there was a feedback point that you wanted to get last time that we didn't get to. Do you want to do that after the questions?
Sure.
Okay. Since we have a good chunk of questions here, might be good to go over those first. Okay. Well, we can go ahead and get started. Cool. So first things actually, one topic from last time was, and I think, John, I think you may have brought this up on like how are proposals handled, or, you know, if you have an idea or suggestions. So Harvey, you were going to take that, and I believe you put some stuff together. So I don't know if you want to go over it real quickly on the call.
Yeah, sure. So we've put up some issue templates, and there is one for feature extensions where you can you can provide a motivation for the problem, and you can provide a proposed solution. I think that's optional. You might just present a problem and try to solicit some solutions from the community. But I think for now, that's a good starting point. And if we need additional like real-time communication, the Service Mesh Hub channel in our public Slack is a good place to do that.
Okay, is that, I think I might have seen that people are already using that template. Has that been used?
Yeah, we've gotten a few new issues.
And the key is that those issues are labeled as enhancements?
Yep, enhancements would be feature extensions.
Okay. So there's not a separate feature list or anything. You're entirely tracking the extensions. I think Christian mentioned in the Slack too. So your features and extensions are all via that issues list tagged with the enhancements label.
Right.
Okay.
Cool. Is that good for right now on that?
You asking me or
Yeah.
asking Harvey?
I guess, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I guess so. You know, this is always a process. You work through it. So I sounds like a fine starting point for me.
Okay, great. Yeah, and as things come up, and we can also use this format to like discuss any new proposals, or if things require discussion, we can use this meeting to do that too.
Yeah, I mean, I think the only thing that came up last week, which I guess is probably not something we are able to write down, but when do you want a design doc? When don't you need one? You know, those kind of things. You know, how big is the feature? So I guess that's will be handled more ad hoc based on if it looks big, then maybe a doc is needed. If not, maybe not.
Yeah, it'll kind of emerge throughout the discussion, right?
And you can, I think right now it's a bit informal. and we can take it up, like you said, ad hoc. There might be opportunities for us to schedule a meeting also and just do it in real time and then just take notes afterwards. So right now, let's figure out what works best. I mean, if you have an area that you want to contribute to, and it's a good idea, then I mean, we don't want to put too many hurdles in the way.
Okay, sure. That works for me.
And then let's see. Then let's go down to one of the questions. Do we want to start, John, since you're on the call, we can start with the two that you added here.
Okay, let's see what I remember what I added. Yeah, so I think a little bit, we kind of talked a little bit about the first one just now. And last week we talked about a roadmap and stuff like that. So I was trying to dig and understand and get whether there's any sort of formality or like a designated sort of list of target areas or a mapping of things to releases or anything like that. And I wasn't expecting there was, but I wanted to ask if I was missing something. And I think from the discussion we just had, we're mostly tracking things via that issues list, via the feature enhancements, and that's the amount of formality that we want or need right now. Is that really the correct understanding, or if there's more, or there's stuff I'm missing? That's the key thing I wanted to understand. If there's more information available, I'm just missing it, then please point me to it.
Yeah, I would say the issue tracker is everything that we're working on is being run through there. Now priorities and so forth, definitely feedback on Slack and on a meeting like this helps to inform and give weight to the different priorities. And we can go through a couple of things that we've been working on and will likely be up next, at least in the near term. But yeah, there's no other place where that's being tracked. Harvey and Scott, feel free to jump in anytime if there's a better way to kind of engage with the community in terms of priority.
No, I think you captured most of it.
I think so. I think it's like I said, I think at the last meeting, it's really valuable for us to know what are the priorities for the community. You guys are hands-on with Istio to different extents too. And, you know, the more information, because I feel like Istio has so many different ways you can use it. And part of the trade-off that Service Mesh Hub makes is about nailing down conventions and like where are areas where we can simplify, where we don't necessarily need the complexity. And, you know, getting that feedback. So understanding what are, you know, the priorities of really everybody here, you know, and see if we can get aligned on them or just even discuss them. So just knowing that stuff is super helpful to us. Even if you guys, you know, don't necessarily want to do all the work it takes to open and curate an issue, come talk to us on the Slack. That's really like the best way. And we'll make sure that those issues get, you know, talked about internally, that we open them up on GitHub, and that we can, you know, bring, you know, have as open a dialogue as we can about all of this.
Sure, yeah, it makes sense. I mean, Istio has a lot of knobs and buttons. I think from our perspective, there's others from Cisco on the call that they can speak up, but I think from my perspective and Cisco's perspective, the biggest interest isn't necessarily connecting Istio to Istio. Istio is a well-established art. Art might not be the right word. It can be fairly complicated. So our interest is more when you expand beyond Istio. You have Istio with other environments and other meshes. So our biggest interest is trying to make sure there's kind of flexibility there with respect to Service Mesh Hub being able to embrace those other environments. And I know you spent a lot of time with App Mesh and over the last few weeks trying to get that in. So that's an example of the types of interests that we have more than just Istio to Istio environments.
Well, let me ask you, are we, and we're talking about managing multiple, when you say multiple environments, you really mean like different, like a hybrid set of meshes. So I have different meshes and I have different control, like heterogeneous control planes. Is that how you
Yes.
would different? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. So how will Service Mesh Hub approach the problem of heterogeneous control plane?
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And as I mentioned last week, it's not. I wouldn't. It's less about the control plane itself, and it's more about the fact that those environments have different potential. Surely have different administrative, boundaries, and possibly have different security and networking boundaries too. So how do you kind of bridge across those boundaries while providing some of the great functionality service meshes in general provide, right?
Yeah. Okay. So it makes sense. So the focus of the question and the discussion here is really on where are we tracking the roadmap for that kind of stuff?
Well, so I think you answered the question, but then Scott, I think, turned around and asked me a question, which is, where's your interest? So we morphed off.
Okay. All right.
We morphed off. I was trying to respond to him with what our interest is. So we morphed off the original question. Of course, yeah, I mean, from the perspective of us trying to understand if the rest of the community has alignment with our interest, having a clear and concise roadmap helps with that. But I also understand, we're just starting with this as a community. So, it's a little ad hoc and that allows it to be more flexible, which is fine.
Yep. Are you actively working on in an environment where there's an app mesh and an Istio right now?
Well, I'm more on the front end exploratory side of engineering, so I'm not able to give you actually production environments. There's other people are dealing with those kind of interfaces, but from the perspective of what I'm interested in, yes, I'm interested in app mesh with Istio. I'm interested with Istio with Linkerd. I'm sort of interested in all those, and I don't necessarily have a priority right now because I'm trying to look at it more holistically. But there's probably people on my marketing and product teams that would give me priorities if I asked them.
Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. Yeah, and we can go into more detail. I think that generally the abstractions that we're setting in place in the architecture right now, our intent is to have those abstractions cover those use cases, both from generally how the service mesh operates in terms of communicating over different networks, going through different gateways, doing at times transformations, and then of course like the way that service mesh hubs these types of things. So we have the mesh service abstraction, we have the virtual mesh abstraction, the mesh workload abstraction, and those fit. Harvey, for example, did a lot of work on getting those concepts that we have in service mesh abstractions that we're using in service mesh hub to map up with what, for example, AWS App Mesh uses. So there's definitely the foundational pieces in there in the architecture.
Yep. Okay. Makes sense.
Yeah, if I can just add to that. So what Christian's talking about is we have an internal abstraction. I don't know how familiar everybody is with the internal design of Service Mesh Hub, but basically the idea is to have an API that is portable across, although different meshes, but that can be difficult. I think we kind of saw from SMI that if you go with a lowest common denominator approach, things get tricky. So I think that we're still working with the idea that your API will know about your environment. I mean, I think that makes sense to us because the people who operate the environment, those are the concepts they know. If they write a Kubernetes service, that's kind of what they want to put reference to in their YAML. This is kind of the guidance for the thinking that we're at right now. Just in this example, and if they're running on App Mesh too, they'll want to put in their AWS ARNs or whatever resource selection, whatever they already have in another YAML file. It makes sense to bring it in and not necessarily have to map that across. And then we have this internal abstraction that kind of aggregates everything together in the system. under these, a mesh service, mesh workload, virtual mesh, and does essentially a computation. There's like a big translator piece inside that translates from input resources and environmental data that's collected through discovery, and then outputs the resources for the corresponding mesh type. So we can support simultaneously, Istio and app mesh running together. That's like the overall model. And I think what we're finding now is actually a huge part of the value of Service Mesh Hub is actually that it's putting something on top of those service meshes. So right now, Harvey is working on getting in our support for failover. And this is actually going to introduce a failover CRD that's kind of like a Kubernetes service. And your services can talk to that, and their traffic will automatically fail over. And we're able to do that because we own the underlying Istio destination rules, virtual services, Envoy filters, all that stuff. So the idea then is like, what's the portability of that across different meshes? Because I think that's the real, that's the API that the user is going to want to wrap their hands around. And that's really constrained only by the feature set that they implement today. So Istio is just kind of by far the most ready, but really, I think that we're not, that it's got the largest number of features that allow us to do this basically. That, support on app mesh I'm not sure how long it would take, but
luckily app mesh and some of these other ones are based on Envoy, right? And some of the capabilities we're building out, the one you use there, Failover is a good example. If the data plane underlying supports it, then we should be able to support it. It's just a matter of when.
Yeah, they have to expose it in their API, but
they have to expose it and make it available, right? Yep.
Once they do that, then we can do just what we did there.
So a little bit maybe off the wall question based on what Christian just said. Did you have you explored, or do you have any plans to actually have direct interface with Envoy, or you always expect that you'll go through the control plane of the local mesh to?
It's very interesting you ask, because I think the very idea of WASM is the ability to do that. And, we've already done, we have at Solo, we built another project called WebAssembly Hub. So we're pretty integrated with we know how Istio does it. It's eventually, probably all the meshes will allow you to do that, because that's going to be the way to extend Envoy. And that level will be able to do control plane and data plane.
So it's not an active plan. Well, I mean, you do have that other project. So that other project actually is almost the opposite approach of, going directly to the, so you're sort of seeing how it plays out, I guess, is what you're.
See how it plays out, but there's definitely a complementary fit there, right? So for example, Istio exposes its API, which we primarily use, but it also exposes a break glass, go around the Istio control plane kind of. Console Connect does something similar. AppMesh doesn't do that right now. Kuma, I'm not actually sure. But so the service meshes, when they become more mature, we've noticed that they realize that they don't expose every single possible knob and bell and feature of Envoy, but they do give you some workarounds for that. And right now, that's kind of the way that we're even approaching and using Istio. But the more that they give that control, or WebAssembly starts to take foot, and WebAssembly just gives you the ability to directly configure the data plane, the more we will have a little bit more reach into that.
Yeah, I also wish Yuval was here, because maybe Eitan can comment on this, but I believe that Envoy are actually working on an extension that allows you to plug in multiple control planes. And this is kind of the next step for WASM, so that you can, the problem with WASM today is that it requires you to go through this monolithic control plane, that Envoy can really only have one control plane. And so for Service Mesh Hub, let's say to configure WASM filters, we need to go through Istio to do it. But I believe they're currently working on, I'm not sure the name of the feature, but they're working on a way to make Envoy open to multiple control planes. And, Istio will probably be the first ones to support it, just like they're the first ones to support WASM. But once we get there with each of this, kind of what I'm saying, that gives us the ability to to provide, you know, extension, data plane extension for every service mesh, potentially.
Do you know if that's in any way tied with their XDS v3 protocol that I believe they're also working on? Or is it independent?
I can answer that. The XDS v3 is just a part of their API upgrade. It's not to do with that. It's just a protocol upgrade. So it's yeah. Yeah, I don't know much about the control plane extensions that Scott was talking about, but as far as the API versioning, no, it's just a, yeah.
It's just a v3. Okay, fair enough.
Yeah, they were working on that auxiliary control plane thing. I have to go back and find that. Yeah, I don't know. I'll have to find it. Let's see it.
So do we, if I can just ask, do we have any users who are in the chat who are actively working with Istio today?
On today's call, Scott?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so we've got 3 folks from Cisco and Jason from Morantis on the call today.
That's cool.
So I can't speak for all Cisco, but we do, we have projects in Cisco that use Istio. My group is more about designing solutions including Istio. And I don't, so we have both users of Istio, we have products that sort of integrate with Istio, and as I mentioned before, our interest is more this sort of intermesh multi-environment kind of scenario. But other people from Cisco can comment if they have more specific details they want to add.
Yeah, I asked because I just think it's, like I said before, there are opinionated decisions. We're actually working through a bit of a refactoring of the code right now inside of Service Mesh Hub, and it's giving us an opportunity to vet a lot of the assumptions that we made. And this was when we originally wrote it. It was actually a bit earlier. I mean, really, when the work started on this, it was more than a year ago. And since then, a lot of there's just a lot more users. There's a lot of use has built up during that time. And so I think it would be helpful to hear some feedback about like, what I really want to know is, what are pieces of Istio that you find you don't need to configure, but you feel like you do, or, you know, things that you wish were automated from you, things that you don't want to control, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I'm probably not a good person to answer that particular question, so I'll shut up. And
Sorry, not to stop this, but for 2 seconds, I just want to say, John, I was incorrect, and I just found this Envoy GitHub issue. I sent it in chat with the accompanying design doc about proving me wrong about how the v3 transport is supposed to accommodate. It's supposed to help to accommodate that exact situation.
This is the issue I was looking for. Nice find.
Nice.
So anyway.
okay, I'll look at that. Thank you.
Hey, Jason, can you comment a little bit about what you all are seeing over at Morantis?
Yeah, I mean, we just recently introduced Istio into our product. And so my focus right now is working with customers on seeing how they're using it and what features they need. As you might imagine, an enterprise product, most enterprise products are only going to expose some functionality of it, but not the entire solution all at once, because we also have to support it. So right now it's kind of a learning experience for me.
What parts of it are you finding the most urgent need to support?
Ingress, Istio Ingress. But definitely we definitely have customers who want the Envoy piece and want, I think it's mostly the security parts, the TLS encryption, the rules that you can get with Envoy, and so that's probably the next thing after ingress.
Oh, and is this in the Docker Enterprise?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. I appreciate that. You know that a lot of yeah. I mean, Miranda's recently acquired us. I worked for Docker before this.
I worked at Docker before Solo.
Oh, okay. Okay. Well, we'll have to chat offline about play like coworker geography.
Yeah. Cool. So yeah, so that's ingress now, and then you guys will start adding more things.
Yeah.
More things. Okay. Cool.
Is it transparent to the user, or like you've built something on an API on top of it to drive it, or are you exposing Istio directly?
It's through the GUI. So it's for the customer to configure. You don't have to use it. So some customers have their own ingress gateways and don't want Istio or don't want any kind of service mesh. But they see what they're doing. It's at least through a GUI level.
Gotcha.
Can I ask, is there anything about Istio that you guys are leveraging under the hood without the user configuring it? Like anything that's automatically configured just by having the installation there?
For now, no. Again, I don't know the specifics about whether there would be any conflicts if a user wanted to bring their own ingress gateway or use a different one. But I don't believe so.
So this would be a swap out of the Nginx that was in there before.
Yeah.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah, up until now, Service Mesh Hub has pretty much been focused more on the east-west use case. You know, we've discussed how we'll address ingress, and it's definitely on our roadmap. But I just feel because, you know, yeah, well, I wish Adit was here because she could talk more about like the overall, you know, how those decisions were made. But yeah, I think that we're focusing on the mesh use case because ingress is a bit of a solved, you know, it's a more tried and true thing. There are a lot of solutions in the space where mesh, like we looked at the APIs that are currently out there for mesh and we thought that none of them really fit. You know, we looked at the lack of interoperability and we saw a problem there. So, you know, that's my guess is that why those were prioritized.
And so it'd be interesting to know like what all you expose over time.
Has anyone here tried Service Mesh Hub or read any documentation? Do you have any feedback for us? Just interacting with the project itself, the repository?
I mean, we've tried it more from, you know, the demo kind of scripts and that, you know, getting started stuff. We haven't dug in much beyond that. We're starting to, you know, we're starting to try to dig in a little bit more, do some things that may not be directly described in your documentation. But again, I never expect to be a user community directly of this. So it might be others that you're really asking.
Right.
I've been using Service Mesh Hub. I work in the same team as John on this project, so I find it to be really you know, easy to install, configure, and do various you know, traffic routing and things like that. One question which I had was, do you plan to support any centralized logging, telemetry collection of metrics and things like that? Is that something which is it in your roadmap?
Absolutely. I believe next quarter we're going to be focusing on it, like, and this would be something I think to help get feedback for, but basically a feature set around observability. And just like you have a centralized control plane for controlling your mesh, we also want a centralized control plane for observing the mesh. So that's definitely
Yeah, if I'm using a virtual mesh, then it would basically make sense to have everything collected in one place rather than the logs splitting up into two or more meshes. So
Yeah, I don't know if that was me breaking up or you breaking up, but
that also didn't come through so clear for me.
okay, all right.
Pavan, could you repeat what you just said? I think it was it got a little
sorry.
choppy.
Yeah, all I was saying, yeah, I agree with Scott. If I was using a virtual mesh, right, to connect two or more multiple meshes underneath, it would make sense to see all of that in the same place and to sort of work on the metrics, at one place rather than having the logs and metrics to distributed sort of meshes and yeah, being discovered from there.
So can I ask you, how are you federating those metrics today?
Currently, it's a bit ad hoc, where I know that a lot of the traffic testing which I'm doing is going specifically to just one Istio cluster and sort of looking at Prometheus, doing some logging and things like that on that, not really concentrating on the other clusters. But if I apply a lot of the traffic routing rules which you support, then it would make sense to basically collect everything which goes to the different clusters as well, not just the management cluster. So that's where I was coming from.
Yeah. We talked about using Prometheus Federation to aggregate metrics into one Prometheus, and then what we could do on top of it is do things like possibly generate Grafana dashboards that will aggregate things by virtual mesh, or bring in the domain knowledge that Service Mesh Hub has to provide some context for those metrics.
Hey Scott, do we have an open issue or anything on this? So maybe if folks have comments, they can add, some.
It's a great suggestion. I'm not
Let's
sure.
do that. Since it is something we're thinking of, we've already been discussing internally, but then Pavan, you brought it up on this call, like we can now take it to GitHub. Cool. And then we can, Scott, after you do that, we can just, I added this in the notes and we can just add a link to the issue so people can start discussing there.
But Betty, I mean, we kind of got a little off track from the question. So I think one of my second questions was really about service and endpoint discovery. And I noticed, I do see in the enhancement some references to improvements or changes or additions you want to do there. And I was trying to get a sense of where you're at with that, because that's also an area of interest for us. We have some thoughts that might be useful and may want to propose them, but I want to understand what the current state of things are. So is it all captured in those issues? Because a lot of the issues are fairly, like there's one that said, hey, we're going to do restrictive federation, but there's no clear understanding of what that means or is, and how it directly relates to service discovery.
Yeah, so I'm putting those pasting in the GitHub links for everyone on this call so they can see. But if Scott, Christian, Harvey, or Eitan, if you guys want to comment here on, provide a little more color to those issues, and then we can discuss here.
Yeah, I was going to ask, when you say a more flexible way to discover service and endpoints, can you elaborate on that?
Well, I mean, so yeah, you have lots of different places you may want to discover service and endpoints. So the VM case is an example, right? You have a VM, you want to discover services from the VM. It's not necessarily tightly tied to a cluster, okay? And it might only be tied to a mesh by the fact that you have an Envoy in the VM in some way. So you have to do something there, okay? AppMesh has a different view of how services get discovered and they would like to tie things to CloudMap. So that's a different way to discover. We're toying with some other stuff that it's an open source that has some networks and services and endpoints. So we're kind of figuring out how that might link in here. So I guess it's really just trying to understand, where you're at, where you want to go. I think Dominic brought this up last week about the fact that currently it's very tightly tied to, a Kubernetes service and discovery of a Kubernetes service, but it doesn't need to be, right? It could be, tied to anything, right? That provides, I saw one of the issues I brought up was console. So I assume it's not a lot of detail on that issue, but I assume when you say you want to link to console, that you want to specifically link to the ability for console to represent services and maybe some endpoint mappings behind those services. So it's really, there's need for this in numerous different environments, app mesh, console, some proprietary work, all those kind of things. So I was just trying to understand what you had before we launched into trying to suggest, hey, what about this environment? Let's go figure out how we do this specifically with app mesh, or let's go figure out maybe develop a very flexible protocol, perhaps, that everything can be pushed. I don't have any specific ideas. I'm just saying it is an area of interest for us, and we could generate some ideas unless you already have a good foundation of what you think you want to do there.
So we actually in Glue have already implemented discovery for console, EC2, a variety of different backends. And Glue has informed to a large extent the model that we have in Service Mesh Hub. Where in Service Mesh Hub, we import definitions and a variety of backends into this mesh service CRD that we have. So if you look at your mesh services, you'll be able to see what you will see. Like, all we have to do is basically implement the interface for the corresponding backend. But the architecture of the system is already, and the API are already accounting for this. So,
okay, so that's good data. So I could look a little bit at what you did in Glue to see a foundation of how you want to do this.
yeah.
Well, Scott, that foundation is starting to shape up in Service Mesh Hub and the discovery component, right?
Yeah, although the discovery right now is only plugged into Kubernetes.
Yeah.
We will be adding in more for like Cloud Map and Console. That's exactly where we're going to bring the domain, and probably, a little bit cleaned up for the newer APIs that, Glue's implementation is a little bit older. And, it's more for an ingress use case, and it's built for Glue, the Glue control plane. So we'll bring it in for Service Mesh Hub. But yeah, I think you can definitely look at Glue to see how Glue is doing it. Look at the Glue upstream, and there's documentation for all of those.
Okay.
What's usually required is that the user has to provide a secret that gives us a credential that we can use to access, any kind of whether it's console, it could be the AWS API, it could be, I don't know, a Zookeeper instance, where however people are defining their service registry. The nice thing about Kubernetes is by running on Kubernetes, we can just use our service account to access that data. But for an external service, but once the credential is provided, Service Mesh Hub is going to treat all that stuff like it doesn't know or care where it's running on the back end.
Okay. Yeah,
Or,
I can take a look.
And Harvey did some work around building the abstraction for not everything's a cluster, right? And being able to discover things running in app mesh, which doesn't mean necessarily Kubernetes.
Right.
So some of that, those foundations are already the assumptions that there will be other sources of record for what is in a service mesh. We've started to lay the foundation for that.
Okay. Okay, great. Thanks.
You guys want to get to? We've got 3 other questions here. Tim and Dominic and John are not. John Dang are not on this call, but we could at least discuss them. So there's a little more context, and then take them up next meeting too if they have follow-on questions. So Tim's got one on multi-cluster management. Best practice for integrating with kubeconfig in multiple cloud types seems to be something Service Mesh Hub hasn't tried to solve. Is that the case? And is there any plans or interest there? Cluster registration mapping to a specific kubeconfig usable in a Service Mesh Hub discovery container seems like it might currently be an issue.
Anyone on the call from Cisco aware, is this where if you need a kube config that reaches out to a plugin like AWS or something, what is Any idea what this might be about?
I might be reading into it, but I think I have an idea. Maybe I'm incorrect. Sorry, I should let this just go.
Well, let me pull up, trying to find the issue.
Yeah, the questions from Tim and Dominic are both, they're both Cisco folks, right?
So I think so. Yeah. They are. They're. We work quite a bit with them, so I can try to represent them, but I didn't study the question. So I think with this specific one that Tim is asking, because we've looked at we've been looking at following work like the Kube Federation work and then the cluster registry work around the Kube Federation. We're very familiar with how Istio manages its multi-cluster. So I think what Tim is really trying to get to here is understand where you're coming from with where your vision, where you came from and where your vision is with respect to that cluster registry. Because a key component of how you're managing things is sort of understanding that what a cluster is, how I can contact it, how I can get information from it and discover things from it. So I think that's the sort of macro question. Now, specifically, he's probably also thinking a little bit about some challenges that I think even Pavan hit this week, where trying to get Service Mesh Hub to play nice with an Istio that's installed on AWS has some challenges because of the way IAM works. And the fact that you need a kube config, but you can't just generate the kube config that works easily due to IAM.
Right, because they defer to some plugin to communicate with AWS to kind of resolve some of that identity stuff.
Yeah, so I think that
okay.
Again, trying to speak to Tim, but I think there were sort of two macro questions. One, two questions at very different ends of the spectrum. One is sort of just, hear some words from you about your thoughts of a cluster registry, how you see it, what's your view of it, and where you think you might want to keep Service Mesh Hub or move Service Mesh Hub to. So that's sort of the high level thing. The more specific one was, okay, just having a kube config for everything has challenges. So what's your thoughts on that?
I can provide some context on this. So for the immediate question of how do you register an EKS cluster, so you can do it manually with the meshctl cluster register command, as long as the user running that command is using a kube config with the cluster admin privileges. That should work. It should just work as in the current state of Service Mesh Hub. The alternative way is to register your clusters automatically in a sort of a discovery-like fashion. So you can provide Service Mesh Hub your AWS credentials. There's a settings CRD where you can configure Service Mesh Hub to automatically discover EKS clusters. There's certain parameters, like you can provide a region, you can provide tags, and it will just go and figure out any EKS clusters that exist in those regions with those tags, and it will automatically register those with Service Mesh Hub. So I think with cloud providers, this is going to like your macro question. I think for cloud providers, if they usually provide some sort of entry point to list out all of the Kubernetes clusters or for any other compute platform you might be operating, and Service Mesh Hub can hook into that API given the credentials that the user provides us, and we can go and do that cluster registration or VM registration automatically for the user. And we'll expose some sort of configuration so the user can tell us which of their entities they want to be managed by Service Mesh Hub.
Okay, that makes sense. So I think this meeting's recorded, right? I could ask Tim to review the recording so he could expand on the question if needed.
Yeah, let Tim know. He can feel free to reach out to me with a DM or something. And if there's a particular issue, we can work through it together.
Okay.
Does that kind of lead into Dominic's question too about identity management?
No, I think Dominic's question is a more specific one, which is, maybe something he noticed that a limitation with respect to current behavior. That which
Yeah,
is,
we should fix that.
you know, basically, I think he saw that he could register clusters twice, and he wasn't sure how. He was trying to probe a little bit based on the issue, whether there's something a little bit more fundamental that in your thinking of how clusters, you know, what they are and what represents them.
So I just wanted to clarify in case. So I thought this issue might be just asking more in general. How do we handle, like, so we have this thing called cluster registry, and what happens is you bootstrap Service Mesh Hub to have credentials to gain access to a remote cluster. And this is actually done by prepping a remote cluster with a service account. And then we generate a kube config from the service account that comes back to the master cluster. And so the master cluster actually can be secured with RBAC. So you're actually using real Kubernetes RBAC and Service Mesh Hub in the register. Like when you run the CLI command, it actually goes it creates the necessary RBAC rules to allow Service Mesh Hub to remotely administer Istio CRDs essentially, or whatever in the remote cluster Istio, like the watch permissions and the RBAC permissions that it needs to manage the cluster. It creates a service account that gets those roles, and then it generates a kube config using that secret from the service account, and it imports it back into the original cluster. So I think what the question is about is when you're actually bootstrapping, you have to use a local kube config, because, and it becomes then this question of, okay, let's say my standard setup, if I have a 10 cluster setup, this is just what I'm reading into it. I could be off base. But if I have a 10 cluster setup and, now you're telling me that I have to run 10 individual registration commands, well, like what are the conventions around that? How do we plan to support from the user experience side? Because the answer is that on the back end, we do have an implementation on how to address this. And I think it's on our, for the user facing side, how does a user, without a tremendous amount of pain, maybe there's a point at which we actually define a YAML file that has a list of your clusters and kube configs, and we can just process that, just, that would be my, if I'm interpreting the question correctly, which I'm not sure that I am.
Yeah, I understood everything you said, but I would not exactly sure how to interpret Dominic's question. I thought it was more a specific issue he was seeing versus a better usability.
I think it's something we've actually thought about, regardless. I see it as being a potential, so it's worth bringing up.
Yeah, there's a couple different things. So I think Dominic's asking, hey, I can register the same cluster twice. Is that desired? Probably not. So we should fix that.
What's the overall story, right, with cluster registration? How is that really like the high level considerations?
Yeah.
And yeah, that's very good questions. We still have a lot of work to do, I think. We're really still in the early stages.
Okay, then the last one here is a question from John Dang on how about multi-cluster, multi-mesh integrating with VMs? Is that, if we can comment a little bit on what we're thinking there.
Yeah, this is, I remember talking with him on Slack. So this is Istio specific when we were talking about it. And basically Istio has a way of running the Envoy proxy in a VM that I believe is connected over the same network to the control plane. And then it does some automation. I mean, you're supposed to do it by hand. Actually, the Istio docs say to do this by hand is to generate the correct certificates and so forth. And so this is probably something that we can automate. I would say, which this might be a great segue to, like, what are the things that we're working on right now, and what are the next upcoming things from more of a technical standpoint. maybe Harvey. So we're working on the failover, the global failover feature, which I think is pretty close. Harvey, I'm not don't want to speak for you there.
Pretty close.
And then there's some things around fixing up the multi-cluster routing things. Like there's a issue that's been open for a little bit that I think John Dang may have raised about doing routing with subset-based routing. So we need to close that gap. And then I think automating some of the DNS stubbing and DNS setup. So there's a handful of these little, some sort of low-hanging fruit things that we've known about for a bit that we want to tackle pretty quickly here. But then, VMs automating some of these edge Istio cases are always up for discussion.
Okay. Those are all the questions. So we've got, if folks are gonna want to hang on for another 10 minutes, we can get to, if there's any feedback that we wanted to get on specific some other areas that we did not cover, or we can call it end of meeting.
Yeah, I think over the next couple of weeks, we'll have some, like I said, the failover stuff knocked out, maybe the DNS and subset routing and some of those lower level technical things. And then we can go from there.
Cool.
Okay, great.
Awesome. Thanks everyone for joining.
Cool, yeah, appreciate your time. Thanks for the feedback and the discussion.
Thanks. Bye.
And see you next time.
Catch you next time.
Bye.